thank you to the committee for inviting me to participate. And I said to Alistair, Irish people are well known for their ability to describe a problem as opposed to solve one. And this talk may fit into that category, but then we have the panel coming up to solve the problem. So I thought it was worthwhile just thinking of the changing landscape and how we have to educate people to address the changing paradigm of clinical science and its implications for regulatory science. So what we're used to is large scale prospective randomized trials looking for very large effects, sufficiently large to be detected by this rather crude instrument to determine signals of efficacy and risk, or even less rigorously, large observational studies in the so-called real-life setting. I'm always amused by the use of the term real life. But in large-scale trials, it's worthwhile thinking about where things break down. So what we're looking at here is the likelihood of approval once a drug, no, it doesn't seem to. Once we get into humans, the likelihood of approval varies somewhere around 10 to 15%. It varies with field and so on. But as you can see, where things tend to break down is the transition from phase 2 to phase 3. And that's because we've really lost sight of what phase 2 in drug development actually is. So what phase 2 is supposed to be is where the mechanism of drug action is defined in humans and where factors contributing to variability of drug response are parsed, and not what it has become most commonly, which are pseudo-efficacy underpowered trials. And there's a real deficiency of the relevant skill sets to do what is supposed to be done in phase 2, not just in academia, but also in industry and in the FDA. It's a real crisis of human capital in my view. And of course, there's a great secular pressure once a drug gets into humans to accelerate from phase 1 into phase 3. In large pharma, it's driven by the participation of marketing from early stages in drug development. And in biotech, it's the funders that usually demand once something has gone into humans to get into phase 3 as quickly as possible. So there's this convergence of a deficit in human capital in the relevant skill sets and large understandable commercial pressures to accelerate through phase 2 that in my view is a real weakness in the system and leads to mistaken choices around phase 3, and we're all familiar with what happens then. So I think we're in an era where the face of clinical research is changing in a variety of interesting ways. So obviously with the transition to coverage with electronic health records, there's the possibility of looking at very large numbers. So for example, to look for unexpected disease associations. And then with linked biobanks to interrogate the possibility of unifying signals that might integrate previously unsuspected associated diseases. From that, one can move to deep phenotyping studies in relatively small numbers of peoples in controlled settings to seek proof of concept. And then to move from there to more targeted phase 3 trials. And obviously there are variations on that theme as well. So I think it's an era where the conventional paradigm of clinical research, which is not going to disappear overnight, but is changing. And clearly as we educate the workforce, we need to be mindful of those changes. Now, I'd like to just dwell a little bit on what I'll call human phenomic science, which is this issue of deep phenotyping. So we can deeply phenotype healthy or diseased individuals under basal conditions, or we can perturb their phenotype. For example, if one is studying the chronobiome, one might perturb the phenotype metabolically or with an inflammatory stimulus like LPS or with vascular stimulus to study temporal variability in the baroreflex. One of the features of human phenomic science is the need to be able to integrate very different types of data. And I understand yesterday you heard much about this, but For example, all the different types of omics imaging, but also physiological outputs like blood pressure, together with remote sensing inputs of various types. And that requires systems integration. It requires very careful curation, particularly in the translational space, if we're trying to integrate information from preclinical models with data derived from the human as a model, and then modeling what might happen and testing whether it does. It requires the development of novel approaches to data visualization, and then it requires expansion using crowdsourcing techniques beyond the intensely studied small numbers of people in a controlled setting to the crowd. So the objective of this type of effort is to develop predictive paradigms around disease evolution and drug response. And for that, we need dynamic modeling. And Ravi Iyengar and Russ and a few of us published something just in the current issue of Science around the necessity to have a dynamic dimension to systems modeling approaches around disease evolution. And then tracking across the life course. So one of the big challenges that faces us is the absurdity of how we build different buildings and have different disciplines for pediatric medicine and adult medicine. And that's not the way biology works. It's a continuum. And yet, because of this, one of the challenges that we're really faced with is the informatics integration across the pediatric to adult divide. And then to consider in terms of predictive paradigms, not just the combinatorial approaches to disease, but actually also the sequencing of those combinations. For an example, there's a lot of interest now in these serial killer T cells in leukemias and in solid tumors. But how do we integrate them in a way that's most efficacious in terms of timing as well as combination with respect to other therapeutic modalities? So I see regulatory science as fitting in this type of domain. If we think of the big box as what's called T1, translational science, translational medicine and therapeutics, which is basically what I've been talking about, is a fraction of translational medicine generally within that space. And regulatory science lies within that space, but also overlaps into the T2 to T4 domains of translational science. But I guess the point I'm making is that regulatory science and translational medicine and therapeutics are really two sides of the one coin. So briefly, I'd like to allude to what I see as the challenges that pertain to the workforce. The rapid evolution of biomarkers, the consideration of not just their analytical, but also their clinical validity, the fact that biomarkers that may exist for molecular therapies are not surrogates for response to those molecular therapies, that biomarkers for disease progression and drug response may differ in their predictive power amongst individuals, and which biomarker to believe. We're familiar with for example, a lipid modifying drug that had biomarkers relating to HDL and biomarkers relating to blood pressure going in opposite directions. And the mistake was to believe the HDL biomarker as the surrogate of relevance. I think in terms of the workforce, there's a necessity to have domain expertise in evolving platforms. There's this issue where we consider, particularly with respect to drug exposure, the listing within the health record of drug exposure is not the same thing as actual drug exposure. We have increasing pressure to study early investigational drugs in combination. This issue of sequencing that I mentioned, drug-diet interactions, and then the necessity to foster the commons, to broaden the pre-competitive space, so that we particularly can have early interrogation of the complete spectrum of drug action and not just to focus on what people think is relevant to the primary basis of approval that they're seeking. And then issues of access, distribution, and pricing. And as far as pricing is concerned, we're familiar with the 32% decline in the stock price of Valiant, thanks to one of the presidential candidates pointing the finger, and now Valiant saying they're going to abandon that particular sector of their business. We're familiar with the advantage taken of drug distribution networks in the case of Daraprim to increase the price by 20-fold. And we're familiar with the dramatic change in terms of the efficacy of new drugs for hepatitis C, and yet the astounding cost of treating everybody who is relevant to those drugs, and how tiered pricing applies across countries. And as you know, the cost of the drug made available in Egypt has been described as the business case for invading Egypt. That we're in a landscape where we have shifted dramatically to generics. And then this issue of comparative effectiveness, which we dance around in this country and don't address directly, but can begin to be addressed using EHRs outside the bounds of conventional politics. And I would say the inevitability of something like NICE. And then finally, obviously, regulatory science has to deal with the issue of tobacco. We're dealing with a global game here. We have US multinationals. We have a shift in an asymmetric shift in the consumption of tobacco products. We have the challenge of e-cigarettes and snus. Are they a lesser harm or not? We have the issues extending from tobacco out to fast food, alcohol, and then the issue of recreational drugs and the necessity to standardize, label, and evaluate efficacy, as well as control advertising in the particular example of cannabis. And then the final element that people have to deal with is that patients are more empowered, better informed. You heard a lot about social media yesterday, crowdsourcing for trials of efficacy and risk, power of rare disease consortia, and patients are best positioned, not companies, to identify unmet medical needs. And their demand for transparency of trial results, I think, is a force for good. And clearly there are opportunities in terms of engaging patients to pursue post-marketing surveillance in more imaginative ways than we have done for now. So at last, I get to what Alistair has asked me to speak about. I told you all I do is describe the problem. So really the issue that I'd like to raise is that there's a multi-dimensional shift in the regulatory ecosystem. This isn't just a few things at the edges. And it's driven by technology, it's driven by a demand for transparency, and it's actually driven by trade. I mean, you're probably well aware that one of the big political sticking points with both the Trans-Pacific and transatlantic trade agreements that are going on around at the moment is all about how we protect the intellectual property and the pricing structures consequent to that relating to drugs. We have, and we'll talk about how CTSAs can play a role here with introductory degrees, particularly master's degrees and certificates, to get people into the game as far as regulatory science is concerned. But there needs to be a continuing connection to the broad domain of translational medicine and therapeutics. And perhaps one route for that are these FDA centers of excellence, but if they are going to be, they need to diversify, they need to broaden in their remit, and they need to churn more than they have. And finally, this is a global game, so we need to globally source information, globally source recruits, because our influence is going to be global. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.